So welcome back to the Mobile Home Part series. This is actually part six. So in part six, I want to talk about my interaction and time commitment with my offsite property manager. So as I described in my first video, the structure is I would talk to the offsite manager who is actually based in California. They manage about 70 mobile home parks in the southeast, and they kind of are used to doing larger turnaround parks like mine, where you're fixing a lot of vacant park-owned homes and then doing a lot of teardowns and infilling a lot of homes. So they're actually very big advocates of the park owned home model. They actually like it better versus the tenant owned home models. Um, I'll kind of give my opinion on that in a later video. But for in Alabama, it's definitely a renter's market. So the best that you can do is put someone on a rent to own um, you know, lease, for example. So, for example, if the rent was $500, typically I'd put them at 550, an extra $50 a month, and you would do like a 5 year contract. So in a year, it's $600. Over 5 years, that's $3,000, and basically that's enough to basically take over the house, and they would then pay me lot rent of $250 a month, for example. But unfortunately, it sounds great to say, and when you hear on podcasts and whatnot. But the reality is, the chance of them actually making through the 5 years on a rent to own lease, it's very rare because the moment something major breaks down, they basically it gets kind of gray where like they technically should fix it, but if they don't, and let's say they were to leave, you end up getting stuck to fix it anyway. So it's kind of this weird mix where like ideally they should fix it, but they don't. I mean, if they leave and they break the contract, at the end of the day, you're stuck fixing that unit, right? So it's the ones that do make it great, but your success rate, I'd say, is probably like 10 to 20%. Like I said, once you're a renter, the mentality is different versus being a homeowner. In this rent to own model, it sounds great to say, but the success rate is so limited, right? Like it's just a different mentality. These people might get laid off, they can't afford the extra $50, and they'll leave. um, Something major breaks, like I said earlier, they don't want to deal with it. Like, wow, I don't want to pay $300 for a new oven, or I don't want to pay for like a new fridge, or my roof's leaking, I don't want to pay for this. And even though I have like a handyman on site that they could pay to have it fixed, like it's a different mentality, right? To do that. So you have to get comfortable with managing those park owned homes, and having systems in place to do that. So that's just kind of been the reality. So what I did was I actually had weekly touch base calls with my offsite um, property manager. Um, so I kind of went on a side tangent there, but I would talk to my offsite manager, who would then talk to my onsite manager. Then my onsite manager would then talk to my renovation crew. So it's multi-layered, right? But what I'm learning and what I'm teaching my students now is the more uh, points in a process, the more points of failure. So there's communication from me to my offsite manager. If there's a delay, if there's a 1 day delay, that's there's a delay there. And then from my offsite manager to my onsite manager, there's a delay there. And then my onsite manager to my renovation crew, there's a delay there. So let's say there's a 2 day delay between each point. That's 8 days of delay, right? So by the time I say something to when it actually gets done, it might be like 8 days. So more points in the process, more points of failure, more points of delay, right? So you can see it right there. So I would talk to my offsite manager only on a weekly basis. I would not bypass them and talk to my onsite property manager to not create mixed messages. You want a consistent message at all times. So I would talk based on a weekly basis, and I would get updates about the park. Obviously, since I'm doing heavy renovation and value add, I want to know what the updates are, what are the issues. I'd get my monthly reports on a like usually the third week of the month. I would get all my reports through Rent Manager. Um, More on that later down the road. And then from there, I would get updates and make quick decisions for them. So they would ask me like, "Oh, so even despite having like two property managers, you still are heavily involved." So I'd probably spend around maybe it was about 30 to an hour every Friday morning that we'd have a touch base call. And what I would do is actually would take notes myself, and I would have like, imagine like a meeting, right? I'd have meeting minutes, and then I would have action items to follow up on to hold my offsite property managers accountable. And I kind of threw them off a little bit because they probably weren't used to having, them being held accountable. Number one, and number two is like having an owner this engaged. Like they straight up told me that like I'm probably one of the most engaged owners ever, and it's supposed to be passive. But from my experience, and it proved to be right. Like only the owner will care about their park as much as them. Because like, I'm literally writing the checks every month of $20,000, $30,000 a month to renovate these homes, right? And for them, they're just telling someone it's just a W-2 job for them, right? So they're not as invested. They don't have as much skin in the game as I do. So of course I'm gonna be more engaged, right? I don't want to sit back because unfortunately you have to light fire under them, and it's proven. Like in the beginning, I went every week, held them accountable, and then we started lowering the frequency, like to every 2 weeks, to every month, and guess what happened? They started dropping the ball because fortunately the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So that's why I learned from this part that's proven. Like you have to be in their ear on a weekly basis. Even if it's not a 30-minute call, whether it's like a text, 5-minute touch base, you can keep it really short. But the key is you want to have frequent communication so you're like fresh of mind because they're managing, my offsite's managing 10 parks, right? So she has 10 owners coming at her doing that. So, I want to be on top of mine, and mine's the biggest project, right? I'm spending a lot of money. So I'd get those monthly reports to the rent manager. So I'd get my profit and loss statement, my rent roll, my delinquency report, all these reports that rent manager does. And then for there, basically they would then, my offsite manager would have a weekly calls with my onsite manager, and my onsite manager would reach out to my offsite to authorize like anything that needs to be paid for or request. And then the onsite would then coordinate with my renovation team. So, like I said, there's a lot of moving pieces, and my offsite, so I would pay them a monthly fee, and then I'd pay my onsite manager, a monthly, you know, fee as well as they get free rent living there. Um, so, there's just a lot of moving pieces. So for me, I like doing the weekly to stay on top of mind, but also as an opportunity for me to help and learn and help get creative ideas, right? Because like at the end of the day, they have to kind of listen to you as the owner, but I'm newer in the business and they've been in the business a lot longer. Like I think the property management company, they've been in it for like 30 years, and his daughter was actually managing my park, and she's been in the industry for about like 20 years as well. So I think they're highly experienced in that, but at the same time, it's different to be an investor versus like a property manager. I think the owner of the property management company, he owns, I think, 10 mobile parks himself in the Southeast, which I liked. But, what I kind of learned was the the head guy that you talk to, like they're usually great, but usually the regional uh, property managers, who are the 10 of them, they're not usually as great, right? They're usually like W-2 employee, very minimal mentality. So, um, when you're working with the mobile home park industry, fortunately, you kind of have to be really tough and hold people accountable and hold people to deadlines. And I think my offsite, she struggled with that a little bit. I think she was a little bit too nice. She was on the nicer end. And, I can't blame her. That's just your personality, right? But when you're dealing with, this on-site manager that you're paying $2,000 a month, they're not going to be as educated. You're going to have to be a little tougher on them. And unfortunately, in the Southeast, they may not respond as well. Like guys may not respond as well to females. So sometimes I had to leverage the owner, who was, a guy. He had a very loud, booming voice to like get them motivated to do stuff. So it's almost kind of like a good cop, bad cop routine, where like the offsite would be the good cop, and then occasionally I had to bring in the owner, who was the bad cop, to light fire underneath my on-site manager to get them to work faster and do what they're supposed to do, right? So you need like a good balance, and that's what I like about that. And I would have weekly calls, and kind of lesson that I learned was, when you take over a park, they're already managing it for the current owners. And when I bought it, I retained them on as well because it was part of the purchase contract that they would retain it, and they knew the park, so they would know what to do. But kind of the downside of that, and I never do this for my apartments, is they were saying that, oh, the other owners weren't, like, they were too cheap to evict the tenants that weren't paying, right? So I just said, okay, well, I have money allocated, I'll evict the tenants. And what I quickly came to realize was that they just didn't know how to evict the tenants, right? Like maybe the owner was probably too cheap to do it, but they were probably just throwing blame at the prior owner, saying that he was a bad operator, not us. But in my mind, I'm like, well, you're the property manager. Like, I get it. They're just saying we're stuck. Like, we want to evict these people. We had everything set up, but the other owner didn't want to pay. So I just said, okay, that makes sense. But I'm willing to pay. But I was willing to pay, but they didn't know how to like evict the tenants. Like, and there's a lot of like, I think some changes where we had a judge, and the judge wanted us to follow a certain procedure, and for some reason the on-site manager, they're not very educated. Like you said, most of them don't like graduate high school, for example. So it requires the offsite manager, and then I just kept on getting this like beat around the answer, to the point where like I felt like I just had to call the courthouse directly and ask for the process. And that's why I kind of figured, working with these property managers, like some of them, like they just on site doesn't know what to do. The off site's not willing to take like ownership and do it. So I, as the owner, would step in and be like, I'll call them and do that. And they weren't used to that. But I just said that, well, if you were doing your job appropriately, I wouldn't do it. But because you're not doing it and I'm spending money to operate this park, I'm going to do it. Right. It's going to take me like a 30-minute phone call. I'm going to call like the eviction court, and ask like, hey, how does the process work? And then do that, right? So I was able to get that, but unfortunately, with COVID, it was around COVID time. It just kept on getting the court date kept on getting pushed back, right? Like, oh, um, we're backed up in the court. Let's push it back. Oh, a court date's on October. Someone in my family has COVID. I can't go. More delays, right? So it just took forever and forever to get things delayed. So that was a little bit humbling experience for me. I thought Alabama was a little more landlord friendly than that. But given COVID and all the situation, there was just a lot of room for delay, and I just felt like it was like California, right? Like Oklahoma might evict someone in 15 days, regardless of COVID or not, right? It's easy. Um, so that was there, and then the property manager, this is all property managers. They start off great. They send all the reports on time. Um, and I'm actually experienced in my 20th unit as well. Like, on the first couple of months, they're on time, and later they get lax. Like, oh, they don't send you the report. They don't send you the report. They don't send you the report. And you get to kind of probe them, and they'll give you every excuse under the moon as to why they can't give you the report on time. But to me, like a strong property manager, they will give you the reports on time, right? Like my 20 unit, I don't even have to ask them. Like the first of the month, like for example, in March, it's March now. I got my February reports already. And it's like March 4th, right? Most property managers would want like till the third or fourth week of March before you get your February reports. And even then, like they don't provide it on time. I have to prompt them to do it to via email, and usually when I email them, they'll give it to me. But basically, property managers start to kind of slip up a little bit, and I was definitely noticing that as well. But for me, I had a Wells Fargo account, so I could track my income and my expenses in real time. So that kind of helped me see like how much we were spending, how much rent I was collecting. And then another struggle that I went was with collections. Like these tenants, like my offsite manager was too soft on my onsite manager, who was too soft on the tenants to collect rents. So I just said, well, I'm basically paying both of you guys to collect the rents, and if you can't do that, what's the point of having an offsite and on-site property manager, right? Like they don't quite understand that. And I just said, we have to collect rent. So what we did was we had to leverage the security guard to start collecting rent for us, to create more intimidation. And I said, it takes a certain personality to knock on someone's door. To collect the rent. Fortunately, my property manager, he was really good at renovations, but he wasn't great at collecting rent. So that's just kind of the nature of the business. Like I think the wife was great at collecting rent. She was a little bit more of a bad cop, but she got injured and she couldn't do that anymore. So I had to leverage my security guard to knock on the door and be the bad cop to collect the rent. So unfortunately, if you have someone that can do both renovation and be kind of the bad cop to collect the rent, you have the perfect person. If you're paying them, $2,000 a month, right? That's the best you can get. So, I'd have weekly cadence calls, and as the owner, I never like to be the bottleneck in the business. I always like respond timely with that, to remove barriers. So, kind of lessons I learned is, when you have an offsite manager and an onsite manager and a crew that is renovating, when you communicate something to your offsite, by the time it gets to the actual crew who's doing the work, it might be like a 1 week delay at least. And when you play telephone, the message gets misconstrued as well. And even despite having offsite onsite property manager, like my mobile park, I was the most active. I spent the most time, the most energy on that compared to my 2 apartment complexes that I own, my 46 units that I'm renovating. Like those are a lot more passive, a lot more simple. I just, in the beginning, I touch base with them once a week. Now I just text them for an update and they'll give me the update. Usually on Fridays, they know I'm going to text them and they'll give me their update. But for the mobile park, I was very engaged. Like sometimes I had to do their job for them. Like I would step in and be like, okay, let me figure out this eviction process. So that's very common. Like don't expect it to be fully passive. Like mobile park, you can make a lot of money, but you're gonna put a lot more capital in. You're gonna put a lot more time in. But you can make a lot of money if you do it right. So more money, more work. And the next point is they will never care as much as their park as you do. So they don't have skin in the game, right? Like my offsite manager, she gets paid the same, regardless if she does anything or does a lot. On-site manager gets paid the same, regardless if he does anything or not. That's a W-2 fallacy, right? Whether you actually work or not, you get paid the same every month, right? So as a result, you have to constantly be on top of them. You have to constantly be educating yourself about mobile home parks. So even when I bought the park and throughout owning the park, I was listening to a lot of content on mobile home parks, learning, because you need to trust but verify your offsite manager. I initially assumed that since they operate mobile home parks for 20, 30 years, they would be teaching me. That's not the case. You have to ask them the right questions and then they'll answer you and teach you. And sometimes some of the questions I was asking, they never even knew. So, like I said, you always have to stay educated. You cannot assume that they're going to teach you everything. While it's nice to say, like, that's what appealed me towards them. Like, hey, you've been in the business 30 years, you can teach me. But, they don't care as much as you do. So you got to, like, still ask the right questions and probe and get the ball rolling whenever you can. So, hopefully, you found value from this video and hope to see you in the next one. Thank you.